Oh yeah, pointing at the screen like it's 2008. Is Spider-Man afraid of heights? Welcome back, true believers. This is a follow-up to last year's Spider-Man video, where I threw out my own hypothetical take on the web swinger that picks up in the 90s for aesthetic and cultural reasons, and centers on a more urban legend Spider-Man who still has yet to find his feet and truly accept his strange nature in a world that doesn't have other superheroes yet. If you haven't seen part 1, or you have and it's just been a while, I strongly recommend brushing up on it because it lays a lot of groundwork that I don't want to repeat here. But to sum things up quickly, heroes like the Avengers and even the X-Men aren't a thing yet. Mutants are, but our mutants are a little different. They're mostly popping up in New York, and Oscorp is responsible. This New York has a mood like Dark City or The Crow, where it's basically an entire world in itself, a surreal reflection of Peter's fluid emotional state, devouring him one moment and sprawling open for him the next. Early stories focus on Peter's neighborhood, swinging within the 5 to 10 stories range, but rarely venturing higher than that. He explores and ascends through the concrete jungle as he grows more confident, but it takes a while to reach that point. Spidey's evolution is also reflected in his costume design. Up till recently, he's been trying not to be seen, wearing darker colors and keeping his head down, keeping a low profile. But as a new wave of enemies like the Scorpion force him to be seen, he wants the best side of himself to show. So he puts more work into his costume, making it streamlined and brighter, more colorful, more like the Spidey we know and love. But again, gradually. Also, he looks like Edward Furlong because 90s. To touch upon other superheroes again, from the beginning, Spider-Man has existed relative to them. He's more like us than most of them are, and so we look up to them or scrutinize them as he does, through his eyes. One of his first stories shows him trying to join the Fantastic Four. He did join them eventually. So things like the MCU movies where he's just along for the ride and they're the real stars, well, that is a more comic-accurate Spider-Man, but accuracy isn't necessarily always better. We've gotten many versions of this character that have frequent run-ins with the Avengers, the X-Men, and all manner of other Marvels. That's part of the fun, is seeing him drag them back to Earth with his unique, scathing commentary. But, like I said, we've had many versions of that, and it's great fan service, sure, but some of the most intriguing, evocative takes of all were the ones that focused on Spider-Man's world, where he was basically on his own. Just look at Spider-Verse, itself a giant crossover with many Spider people. Can you imagine how out of place Captain America would feel dropping in? Or the Punisher? Some of you may think, hey, that sounds awesome. But this is going to be a more isolating, laser-focused take. We're dealing with a more straggling Peter Parker this time, and I want the emotion to come from how utterly lost he is in this new world he has to explore his own way, wanting so badly to reach out to someone who might understand him, but just feeling more alone by the end. In other words, the experience of teenagers everywhere. As for the format, I think there's a case to be made that a Freak of the Week episodic formula can be perfectly compelling if you essentially treat each story as its own movie, with a point to make, and just try not to repeat yourself. The best volumes of the Ultimate Spider-Man comics were like this, and Spider-Man the New Animated Series pulled it off scarily well at times. This would be an anthology series. We'd have some connecting threads, of course, you need development, but especially in these early stories, I'd keep things self-contained because I think it works for the boxed-in, more in-your-face atmosphere I'm trying to create. Sure, words like isolating or claustrophobic aren't exactly words most people would use for New York, but this is Peter's New York. It's a scary new world. Now we just need a title. It's hard to find adjectives that haven't been used up in Spider-Man media already, and I toyed around with ones like the Magnificent Spider-Man or the Essential Spider-Man, but for this take on things, I've settled on the Infamous Spider-Man. Ooh, I think he's trying to tell me something. Yeah, here we go. Another thing the new animated series proves is how easily you can throw entirely new villains at Spidey, ones like he's never faced before, and might seem kinda lame at a glance, yet create some of the most suspenseful situations he's ever been in. So in the next video, I'm gonna show off some of my own villains, their designs, their backstories, but this video will focus on classic rogues, giving them the treatment I gave Scorpion in part 1. But one more thing before we get to that. There's a tendency to romanticize Peter's roots. It seems someone's always overcomplicating the origin story with conspiracies, like his parents were CIA agents, or they created the spider that bit him, or they messed with his blood when he was little, or some Greek spider goddess endowed him because he's special. And that just misses the entire appeal of the character. That being, anyone in Peter's shoes could have received his amazing powers. Spider-Man is the antithesis of the Chosen One narrative. He is not a messiah, he is not Destiny's Child. He's just a guy. If the spider bit Mary Jane, or Liz Allen, or Flash Thompson, or Harry, or anyone else on that fateful field trip, they could be the one behind that mask, if that's their inclination. It all hinges on what sort of person is underneath, and even in that regard, Peter Parker isn't special, especially not our version. He just has a very personal moral ethic imparted by his late uncle. Without that, Spider-Man could be a total putz. I think the Ultimate comics were the best attempt to expand on Peter's roots without going too far, where his father Richard Parker attempted to cure cancer, and his gene therapy research basically opened the door for the more extreme biological tampering by lesser men years later that creates half of Spider-Man's rogues gallery. Oops. It wasn't planned or anything like that. Pete's dad was just the first domino to fall. It's like Dr. Connor says in those comics, Einstein didn't mean to create the atom bomb. It just sort of worked out that way. In my version, I won't build a web of lies around Peter's progenitors. I'll just make them a couple of Oscorp interns. Instead of the usual plane crash, maybe they die in a tragic lab accident, and Norman Osborn, well, he's not the nicest guy. He doesn't normally get all weepy over the help, unless it's for show. But seeing how close the boys were, he always felt he'd owed something more to the surviving Parkers. He met with Peter personally to try to console the boy, though you can imagine little Peter didn't take the apology well, and blamed Norman for his parents' death, and in turn, well, so did Harry, kinda. This actually did affect Norman, so since then, he's always tried to look out for the boy, more so now that Ben's gone. And these days, Peter's forgiven him and they have a perfectly amicable relationship, at least on the surface. Deep down, Peter knows Norman's a creep, and his spider sense is constantly active on a very low setting when the guy's around. Norman respects the man Peter is becoming, thinks he'd be a good influence on Harry if they hung out more like they used to. But like I said in part 1, Peter hasn't spent much time with his friends since becoming Spider-Man. But let's say, 4 or 5 episodes in, the boys do reconnect, and not in a way either expected. As the first time Peter sees Harry in ages, he's in the costume, defending Harry from a threat. Later, Harry goes to tell Peter how crazy it all was, and from there, it's just like old times. Harry starts coming by fairly regularly just to hang out with Peter. He even starts calling Aunt May, but after a while, Harry notices some things are off. They start meeting less as Spider-Man's world demands more of Peter's time, and their dynamic completely changes when after another half-dozen episodes, Harry finds out Peter is Spider-Man. Yep, Harry puts 2 and 2 together pretty early on, before Gwen, before May, before anyone else, and it'd be in a pretty funny way. Like he just confuses Spider-Man and Peter's voices and goes, wait a minute. And so, Harry becomes Peter's ally. He covers for Peter, protects his secret, especially around Daddy Osborn because, well look, Harry loves his father, but he doesn't know what the old man might do. Sure, Norman respects Peter, a good influence and all that, but if this made it back to him, he might just lock Peter up in a lab and try to replicate what happened to him. Harry doesn't know, and that's scary. He might not even tell Peter he knows at first. We'll continue this plot point in part 3 and see how the Green Goblin fits into all of this. Okay. Now we get to some villains. Spider-Man is one of the greatest rogues galleries ever created. They're iconic, they're memorable, fun to play around with, and the best ones usually mirror Peter in some way. Many are sad aging men of science who feel let down by the world, and the moment they receive a smidge of power, a gift like his, their first instinct is to use it irresponsibly. It's not always that the power corrupts these characters, sometimes it just reveals who they already were deep down. And Peter totally would have become one of these guys if not for Uncle Ben's guidance. That's why he pities his enemies and tries to help them a lot of the time, but some of them are just too set in their ways. Our villains are gonna be a little different. A few will still be privileged old fogies, but I'm gonna age some of them down, closer to Peter's age, maybe their 20s. This means fewer proxy fathers and more proxy older siblings. People still just young enough and flexible enough that maybe he can stop them from destroying themselves. So let's get to know a few of them. At the end of part 1, the Scorpion's defection from Oscorp started a supervillains arms race. The likes of the Vulture, the Rhino, the Beetle, all sorts of animal-themed get-ups were inspired in his wake. The same tech that Norman used to enhance Mac is now being peddled throughout the criminal underworld. Most of it reverse engineered, some of it smuggled out of the company right under Norman's nose by sellouts like Adrian Toomes. Not to mention Norman has other pet projects deep within the building, soon to be unleashed upon the world. You could have rival gangs led by Tombstone or Hammerhead, but no one would get as big as the Kingpin or the level Tombstone was at in Spectacular Spider-Man. At least for the first couple of seasons, Oscorp is casting the biggest shadow over the city. Spider-Man, Scorpion, all these key players live within it. A running theme with early villain encounters is Peter facing his fears, learning to be a more capable Spider-Man that the changing face of New York needs, rising to face the new threats that no one else can. So as I said at the beginning, here's a fun idea. What if Spider-Man was afraid of heights? It's not something many versions of Spider-Man ask us to think about, but barely a minute into this game, I experienced vertigo like I never felt in anything Spider-Man related. I don't know how many of you have noticed, but Times Square is big. I don't just mean the buildings are tall, I mean some of them are really far apart. And in a big open void like that, all our Spider-Man has to do is slip up once, and his webs may not even connect to the buildings. I can imagine Peter's spider sense blaring just looking at that big gap of nothing. These first couple years he's been at this, he's been sticking to lower areas. Trying to elude Spider-Man, the crooks peddling Oscorp's tech are meeting in higher and higher places to receive the goods from their carrier pigeon, the Vulture, who's getting back at Norman for failing to appreciate his genius by selling his own, better inventions. Seeing that Spider-Man doesn't come to these bigger parts of the city much, the perps figure they're finally out of his reach. But one night Peter catches up, maybe shoots a web at Vulture's leg, and goes for a ride through a big space like Times Square just dangling helplessly, higher than he's ever been. Vulture cuts him loose at the Empire State Building, diving out of sight. Spidey's ready to faint, his head's spinning. He doesn't know how he's gonna get down at first. Latching onto a corner, he uses his momentum to swing around the building, steadily descending in a spiral motion, just trying not to slam into the side and get himself shredded with glass. He's doing pretty well until the Vulture swoops in and clips a thread with his wingtips, throwing Spider-Man into a tailspin. Maybe Vulture decides he still hasn't had enough fun with the bug, grabs him and drops him high above Central Park, with seemingly nothing for Spidey to catch himself with. Peter would shoot a very short web at a tree just a second before hitting the ground, and fling himself back up with such force he smashes into Vulture like a wrecking ball. Yeah, this is how in your face these early tussles would get. Peter's always on the back foot, stressed out of his wits because he hasn't learned to tell jokes as a coping mechanism yet. The Shocker. What a nothing burger of a character. Whether he's a thug for hire or leading his own gang, he's usually just there to be one of the first guys Spidey beats up before the real heavy hitters show. And while the suit's original design is pretty striking, they've struggled to reinvent his look without overdoing it. Every time they try to make him cooler, they just make him more lame. I think this version is the most atrocious. They piled so much extra crap on him while still leaving some yellow patches because hey, guy's gotta look like a quilt, right? So Spidey can make fun of him for that? Even the Ultimate version, which was just a guy with wrist thingies, I could tell that was Shocker faster than this discount Iron Man. Our Shocker would be simple and streamlined like the original, but more acute. I'm thinking maybe put the emitters on his fingertips so he can control the intensity and area of effect of his shockwaves, like he's developed his own sign language. He could also have some on his feet to jump around or cause tremors just standing in place. And maybe he could do the hey thing to Spider-Man and send point-blank massive shockwaves through the guy's body that would make a normal powerless human explode. That'd be fun. He'd also be one of those villains closer to Peter's age. This Shocker calls himself a nihilist, but he's really just a chronic shock jock who loves shattering people's belief in the world. You know, like so many guys on the internet, but obviously before everyone had internet. Sandman's a fairly malleable character, and he's been done a few ways. And hey, Hydro Man might make a good fit for this series, but he's literally just the Water Sandman. They're the same buff dude in different colors. So I thought, hey, what if they both showed up and they're siblings? And one could be a girl in this continuity. Give them complementary designs, big guy, little guy dynamic. And Sandman's all blocky and thick and rough, and Hydra's fluid and gangly. They'd have their own skill sets for each crime and attack Spidey in unique ways. And then as a last resort, they'd combine their powers and become a giant mud monster. That actually happened once in the comics. I'd call this one Quicksand or something. You could give them all sorts of origins, like maybe there are a couple of Oscorp experiments that escaped, or maybe a competitor like Roxxon or Trask Industries in another country, or a parent did this to them, or they gave themselves these powers, or maybe they could just be mutants whose powers recently kicked in. Vermin. There's an obscure but creepy villain. He's a rat man that controls rats. Though maybe our version doesn't look like a rat, just commands them like some child out of a horror movie. Instead of a guy with makeup, Chameleon could be a changeling like Mystique, with a freaky true form with big chameleon eyes or something. My version would be someone constantly on the run, changing identities to keep one step ahead of their pursuers. And just for fun, let's give them the ability to stick to walls so they could impersonate Spider-Man if need be. Maybe they're trying to get Spider-Man's attention to ask for help. There's a lot you could do with this character if they stuck around. Kraven the Hunter. We know the story. Guy grows bored wrestling tigers and gorillas, hears about Spider-Man and decides he's worthy prey. Sometimes he's a joke, sometimes the writers really try. But I'm not beating around the bush. Dude's a serial killer. In most versions of Kraven, they like to use their hands, or spears and crossbows, get in the mud, get close to the prey, which, alright, that's legit, still scary, but my version of Kraven is more like those big game hunters you see on Facebook, whose lives are so empty they have to fly halfway around the world, sit in a jeep that's more like a castle watchtower all day, snipe an elephant, and take a selfie with it just to get off. The kind of weirdos for whom the best part of the hunt is watching the light leave the animal's eyes. And now Kraven's bloodlust extends to mutants, most of whom are, teenagers, treating them like animals and slaying them ritualistically. Spider-Man isn't the first. Kraven's just been working his way up to the guy. Now, while the X-Men's presence in this series would be limited at best, how crazy would it be if we open with Kraven harassing someone like Nightcrawler? Guy poofs around and can't seem to avoid Kraven's shots. When he finally sees where they're coming from, he teleports behind Kraven, but the hunter was expecting that, and jabs him with a poison dart just as he materializes. The mutant falls over the edge of the building and disappears on the way down. Having had his fun, Kraven figures he'll go after the wall crawler while the Nightcrawler licks his wounds, assuming he even survives the night. Dude was poisoned. The episode would really play up the horror aspect, Spidey being tailed through the twistier parts of the city, realizing Kraven will just pick him off out in the open. When Kraven is forced to close the gap, we see how cruel of a fighter he is. And Peter, he's thinking, I bet this guy doesn't even have powers. I better pull my punches or I might knock his block off with one swing. But it turns out Kraven does have powers, just of the more supernatural variety. Kraven's sudden outburst of unearthly might and speed makes him a terrifying foe, and he even manages to pin Spidey down and rip off his mask. So he can see the light leave his eyes. Doesn't even flinch seeing that it's a kid. And then Nightcrawler appears and jabs Kraven in the back with one of his own darts to incapacitate him, grabbing Spider-Man and teleporting out of there. Nightcrawler didn't want to reveal to Kraven that he was still alive, but he couldn't let Spider-Man be slain like that. There's nothing noble about Kraven's hunts at all, and Nightcrawler leaves the city for parts unknown. The Beetle. This guy isn't that interesting. You could say Shocker's at least a guy in a cool suit, but Beetle isn't even that. It's just the suit sometimes, so let's play that up. Let's make Beetle the coldest, most unfeeling face in this series. Towards the end of the first season, we'd see samples collected from Scorpion and other experiments that slipped through Norman's grasp, along with Spider-Man's combat data collected from all of them, pooled together into Beetle, the tracker that Scorpion was supposed to be. This thing's like a Terminator, creeping through the city, tracking down these mutants systematically and taking them in, or taking them out. He'd be unstoppable, unflinching, and this would force Spider-Man and Scorpion to team up. Realizing that he's basically a robot, they leg it into him until there's almost nothing left, and it explodes in a last-ditch effort to destroy both its targets. And I'm thinking, Scorpion might make a couple of other appearances between now and part 1, but this might be it for him. Depends on if it felt right at the time, in relation to other stories. I don't want to just kill him off in a lazy way, but maybe he shields Spider-Man from the worst of the blast with his armor and it almost kills him. I don't know. Either way, Peter swears revenge, and this is going to affect his friendship with Harry. Cut to Oscorp, and we'd see more Beetle drones waiting to clean up the city. So yeah, this roster's filling up pretty fast. And while most fights would take place at night, you do also have guys like Rhino knocking cars around at noon. In the beginning, our Spider-Man isn't the type to reach out to the community. He hadn't quite fully committed to being a Spider-Man. It's one of the reasons I set this in a pre-9/11 and pre-superhero world. New York didn't really need him yet. But the more of these villains pop up in the streets, the more he grows into the role, the more comfortable he is being seen, and the more he appears in the paper, unflatteringly so, including the pictures. Now at first he considers the whole Clark Kent shtick, but then remembers how easily Harry saw through him and realizes, wait, if I start working at the Bugle and say Spider-Man knows me and lets me take pictures of him, and we have the same height, build, and voice, yeah, they're gonna figure it out.
Hey, who do I look like? The Tick?
So there you go, he doesn't work at the Bugle because, again, we're dealing with a more skittish, cautious Spider-Man. He doesn't do things the way a Peter Parker normally does. He thinks things through more. But he does want a chance to make his case. So he meets Jonah Jameson personally, just knocks on Jonah's window for an impromptu interview. And when Jonah asks why he wears the mask, our hero just spells it out. Maybe gives away too much. Dude, I didn't fall from another planet. I wasn't even grown in a lab. I got these powers by accident, and I'm just making the best of a weird thing that fell in my lap. I have family and friends like anyone else in this city, and if I don't keep them separate from this life, they're all dead. Half the guys I fight tell me, when I get out, I'ma find out who you are and kill everyone you know. And I believe them, so you can imagine why I'm hesitant to let my enemies see my face. Does that answer satisfy you? And Jonah takes this in for a few seconds. If you're worried about your people being dragged into this, why not just hang up the webs? Why risk it at all? Because with great power comes great responsibility. Cut the crap. Give me the real reason. No, hey, look, I've already lost people because I had a chance to do something and I didn't. I thought, someone else will take care of it. You know, the cops. And then they didn't. But I could have. And that's why I do this. My power, my responsibility. Naturally, Peter's expecting Jonah to see him in a better light. But who are we kidding? I thought you were just some glory hog doing this for attention, which is bad enough when you're just putting your life in danger, but now you tell me you've subjected others to this? They're only a risk because you put them there. Do they even know who you are? No, of course not. I haven't... Oh god, it's not even their choice then, whether they're part of this. You make that choice for them. What are you doing? I just told you. I have a moral obligation to use this power, a responsibility to help others. I can't just sit on this. What about your responsibility to your family, to protect them from this mess of a city? If trouble does make it home, when it does, it will be your fault. Swinging around like a maniac, making enemies in every borough, that's the most irresponsible thing you could do. Let me tell you how this is gonna go. This interview never happened. You're gonna go straight home, discreetly. You're gonna destroy that costume. And if you just gotta get your kicks punching criminals in the face, get a damn badge. I'm gonna be sick. Get out before I call the police. Well, that could have gone better.
You want a trial separation already? I understand, but I'm hurt.
See, Jameson's an old-fashioned guy. His heroes wear badges. They wear medals. They wear uniforms. Someone like his astronaut son, that's a hero. A hero looks like that. Now the world is telling him that actually a hero looks like this, and it just doesn't register. At least when his son's ship burned up on re-entry, he went out serving his country, honorably, by the book. The way Spider-Man's risking his life, what he's doing is just... stupid. All this time, he's thought Spidey was an anomaly. It never occurred to him before that the guy was leading a double life, but he could tell that was a kid's voice. And he doesn't want to hurt Spider-Man's family. If he publishes this interview, and it somehow does create a trail of breadcrumbs to Webhead's loved ones, yeah, no, out of the question. This marks a change for Jonah. He still slams Spidey in the paper, but in a broader sense. He's more so critiquing the idea of Spider-Man, the concept. He's hoping that interview was a cry for help, and that in time the kid will just take a hint and stop. The world is chaotic enough already. It doesn't need a wild card like Spider-Man making it even less stable. Remember, this is a world without superheroes. The X-Men, the Avengers, they all could still come along in a decade or so. But right now, the world just isn't ready. At least not Jonah's. Our first season ends with a classic. We've seen Dr. Kurt Connors here and there in earlier stories. Just little interactions with Peter, maybe helping out from time to time. Most of us know his story. Guy loses his arm, tries to grow it back using reptile DNA, turns into a big lizard monster. Guy usually has family, a wife and a son. Sometimes their love is enough to pull him back from the brink, sometimes not. In this version, they're dead. Yeah, died in the same car accident that cost Connors his arm, and he was at the wheel. He never forgave himself for that, much like Peter never forgiving himself for Uncle Ben. You know, Connors lost his kid, Peter lost 2 fathers. It writes itself. And because Connors lost his arm in the same accident that claimed his family, well, he can't bring them back, but getting his arm back is kind of the next best thing. It's some kind of victory over death, a little piece of the life he lost. And as Peter spends more and more time as Spider-Man, Connors loses his moral support. You see where this is going. But Connors' transformation into the lizard will be more drawn out than usual. It'd take 2 or 3 episodes for the process to complete. Say his arm grows back and for a little while, it seems perfectly fine. Better than fine. Doesn't even report a success. Just take some time off to see how this plays out before making an announcement. Anytime Connors incurs a new injury, it heals very rapidly. A paper cut closes up in seconds, but the skin where it healed becomes discolored and scaly. He doesn't take this scabbing seriously at first, but after a few days his new arm begins causing him great discomfort. By the time he takes the changes outside his body seriously and runs some new tests, his insides have already altered themselves dramatically, mostly occurring when he's asleep, giving him all sorts of nightmares. His changing state of mind terrifies him most of all. It's a little bit of The Fly, a little American werewolf in London. You know, it's a slow burn at first. And like in The Fly, once Peter gets close enough to try to help him, Connors rapidly spirals into the final stage of his transformation. Out of all the lizard designs, I don't think anything will ever top the new animated series version. That looks sick. So yeah, more of that. Less of this. Connors is still just human enough to be horrified and flee in shame, but not before almost killing Peter. And cut to the next episode. Rumors float around the city of sewer monsters dragging people to their doom, and it's not like Spidey can just beat the animal out of him. He goes through Connor's equipment and research and whatever's left, remembers everything the guy taught him, pulls a few all-nighters, reluctant to turn to Harry or Oscorp for help. He makes an antidote, a gene cleanser that should revert Connors to normal if PD can inject him. But by the time he tracks Connors down to the city's underworld, perhaps finding Vermin's torn clothes along the way, the Doctor's mind is gone, and while at first his lizard form was pristine and elegant, his healing ability is out of control. Like a cancer, weird extra growths dangle here and there, copies of teeth and ears and toes, even a couple of human-looking ones. Not even Peter's worst nightmares are like this, and it'd be his most brutal fight so far. Beating the lizard into submission, he administers the antidote. Connor's new arm and tail fall off, his scales disintegrate, he starts looking human again. It seems to be working. But he goes into shock, his two selves fighting for dominance, and neither wins. Despite Peter's best efforts, the guy was just too far gone. Some change is irreversible. And this is Spider-Man's greatest failure since Uncle Ben. Another father figure lies dead in his arms. Another man transformed into a monster because Spider-Man exists. One that he killed this time. And he wonders if Jonah was right. Yeah, the series wouldn't often get this grimdark, but I wanted this to be a standout story and really embrace the inherent body horror of the lizards and even Spider-Man's condition. Peter wondering if he's going to end up like that one of these days, and who, if anyone, would be there to help him. This night isn't enough to make him hang up the webs permanently like Jonah urged him to, but it's given him enough self-doubt and trauma to take a break for a couple of weeks. Figuring he isn't in any state of mind to fight crime effectively and will probably just get someone else killed some stupid way until he clears his head. And it's during this reprieve that despite his better judgment, he's able to reconnect with another old friend, Felicia Hardy. So, that was part 2. I had so many notes to go over this time, I decided some were better off saved for their own video. But don't worry, you won't have to wait another year for that. This will cover some original villains, some thoughts on mutants as allegory for real-world prejudices, Peter's love life, the toll all of these connections are taking on his friendship with Harry, and the inevitable entrance of the Green Goblin. And trust me, you are not prepared for that. After that, I think I'll do one more video covering the aftermath, other villains like Electro, Octavius, possibly other symbiotes, and maybe a part 5 if I have enough ideas left over. In the meantime, feel free to critique these ideas. You know, I don't have pipe dreams of this becoming an actual thing. It's just a fun thought experiment for an alternative Spider-Man. If you want to support my work, please consider my graphic novel series Planet Ripple, available on Kindle and paperback. I've just released Volume 5. You can buy the entire series on Amazon or read an early draft of the first book for free. There's also the Toa, my reimagining of Bionicle you can find in my DA gallery. Links to everything in the description. Thanks for watching. See you next time, true believers. Excelsior!